Alright, good morning everyone. This video is actually one of the first of some brief certification bootcamp reviews, and some of the stuff I'm going to cover isn't necessarily things that we've covered during the Cert prep activities or the Photoshop activities in depth. We've touched on some of these, but what I am going to be going over is just a few things that might help you with some of the multiple choice questions that are on the certification bootcamp quizzes. So, first thing I want to talk about is color modes. And if you go into, well, I'll just open a random file. Just give me 2 minutes. Perhaps just open up cat. I think I'm going to open up cat. There we go. So I just opened up cat. As you can see, the cat's just chilling there. The color modes, if you go to image mode, you can see the color modes, and there are several here. The two main ones that we deal with most are either going to be RGB or CMYK. And when we did the color lesson early on in first quarter, we looked at a Venn diagram, a color wheel that was based on RGB. RGB is red, green, and blue mixed together to create all the pixels that you see on your screen. And so RGB is used for on-screen type of graphics. So RGB would be used for video, RGB would be used for web, RGB would be used for things that are directly visible on your computer, perhaps graphics for games, things like that. Even the marquee out in the front of the school uses RGB as the color mode. RGB, because it is what we see on the screen and it is the closest thing to what we normally would see in this interface, it's going to give you the most options in Photoshop normally. So if I go into RGB color here, if I go to filters, all these filters that are available in Photoshop normally are all blackened in because they're available. If I go to image mode and I change it to CMYK, watch what happens. I'm going to get this. It'll say you are about to convert to CMYK using the US web-coded swap v2 profile. This is what happens in Photoshop to basically give you a little bit of a preview of how the color changes when it becomes printed. CMYK is used for printing. So when I click OK, you might not see much of a change in this picture because there's not any really deeply intense colors in here. It's almost close to black and white, but there was a subtle change. You probably can't see it through the video. But anyways, when you switch to CMYK, now if I go to filters, notice camera raw, lens correction, vanishing point, filter gallery, all of those things, 3D, are all blacked out. And then 3D does not have many options available. So what that tells me is that CMYK doesn't have as many features available in Photoshop. And it definitely doesn't include 3D. But with RGB it does. Grayscale, if I go to image mode grayscale, it's going to say discard color information. When I click OK, boom, takes all the color, and grayscale is literally just different shades of gray. And so those are the three main color modes that you'll deal with. You'll also see things that relate to index color, and what index color is when you just have a limited palette and you have an index that lists those colors like basically like swatches. So usually you see those in GIF formats, graphics interchange format. So if you're familiar with animated GIFs or just GIF graphics in general, GIF, that's an index format, or that's a format that uses indexing sometimes. So that's everything about color mode that you'll need to know for now. Next, we're going to move on to content aware move tool. And there's a few ways you can do content-aware moving and filling and things like that. So what that does, you just open up a new file here. I'll find, I don't know, let me do, shoot. I'm going to do flower here. We'll see what happens with flower. It might be a bad example, but if you want to remove something and you want to simulate what it would look like with that thing removed as best as the computer can match it to, you can actually use your select, like some of your select tools, to select the thing that you want to do a content-aware fill or move with. And if you go to Edit, and then go down to, Edit, and then go down to Fill, you'll notice there's, at the top, I think it says Contents, and you can normally fill it with foreground color, background color, which would be foreground, background, or you can do Content Aware. So if I choose that, and I click OK, what it's going to do is try to figure out what was going on in the background, and in this case it just made that flower disappear by kind of continuing the pattern of the green going that way and continuing the darks that were over here. So it's sampling around where that flower was to determine what needs to go in there. So I'm going to go back into history. By the way, don't forget that's how you can go back in history. And I am going to now find the Content Aware Move tool. So the Content Aware Move tool, if you go to where the healing brush, the spot healing brush, that family of tools is, you'll see a thing that says Content Aware Move tool. And what that does is basically gives you a selection. And then when you drag that away to a place that you want to remove that thing, hold on. Let me put it back. I'm going to start over with this. If you move it, what it will do is allow you to move the whole flower or the whole thing that you have selected, and then where you move it to, it's going to sample the stuff that was around it. And again, this was probably a bad example. A good example might have been if I was removing somebody from a picture off on a beach. If I just wanted to show the waves in a certain area, I might move a person more to the left or to the right, and I can select the one person and then place them somewhere else. And it's also another way, if you have a group photo and you have somebody who's kind of standing far off to the left, you can move them closer to the group. Alright, so that's Content Aware. One thing that comes up in graphic design, and again, graphic design is all about communicating a message to an audience. And in the case of most graphic design situations, you're designing for a client. So you're communicating the client's message. And if you're doing an advertisement, you're going to want to find out what the client wants to communicate and who they want to communicate it to. So you're thinking about the target audience and the message that is going to be delivered to the target audience. So if you were to design an ad with little knowledge of what the client wants in their graphic, or if you're communicating with a client that really doesn't know much about design, but you need to know what they want to communicate through design, then you need to talk with the client. You need to have a meeting with them, and you need to find out what their expectations are and what they want in the ad, what they want to communicate, etc. All right, next up, I want to talk briefly about creating graphics for the web, because you might end up with questions that will ask you to give the best, the most likely size for a file that you would use for a website. The first thing I will say is if you're dealing with things that are on screen, the unit of measure is pixels, not inches. Inches are used for print, And as you can see on the screen I have up right now, I have inches selected. If I right click, I can change that to pixels. Pixels are typically used for on-screen stuff because that's the very smallest part of a on-screen picture. If you're talking about something being pixelated, you're talking about the smallest absolute division of your screen. So if we were to create a new file and we want to create it for the web, you go to File, New. You can look in here and there's actually templates that say web up at the top, or presets. Excuse me. And when you look on here, you'll see that usually the first dimension is somewhere close to 1,000. And this is for an actual full-size web page. Now we all know that you can view the web through small devices now. You can view the web through a smartphone. So you might see smaller sizes, you might see bigger sizes for your school computer. Something like 1920 by 1080 might be more appropriate. Notice all of these are at 72 ppi. What that is it's how many pixels per inch are crammed into an inch. In general, for these sizes, it's about resolution. And typically for the web or anything that you have that's going across a network, you want to have a smaller number for the ppi, because what your ultimate goal is to deliver visual content quickly. So having less data to transfer because it's a smaller resolution file, and it has a smaller file size, it's going to be better for the web. So small is better for the web. The other thing you need to know is if you're talking about a banner size, well, look at here. We have web most common, and if we're looking at a full width banner, generally you have a little bit of space on the left and right side. You have margins on the left and right sides of the content on a web page. Let's look at one for example. We will look at mine, andyjeter.com. And if you look, I have all this space over here and all this space over here. It takes about half the screen. And right now my screen is at that size that's close to 1920 by 1080. And so if you kind of cut that in half, you're going to get something, or maybe even something closer to 1440 web medium. If you cut that in half, the width is going to be something more like 700 something, like 728. And you're also going to think about the fact that, well, you're not going to have a banner that is the full height of a website. Instead, it's going to be something, well, let me create a file here, and we'll look at it. So if I did something that was approximately 728 perhaps, it might be a little bit of a hint for a quiz, and a height of about 90, that would be a typical web banner, like a graphic, an ad that you would see on a website. So that area that I have selected, that's about 728 by 90. So that is the second to last thing I want to talk with you. I want to review one other thing which you may or may not have picked up when we were doing the Photoshop lessons, and that is rule of thirds. So for that, I am going to locate my filters file. I actually believe I have it saved in here, so I'm going to go filters, and nope, that's not it. I'm going to look in my Cert prep folder. Just give me a brief second, I'll pause this. Alright, I found it. Here's filters, and you'll remember this is what we had before. You know what, I'm going to find another picture too, just so I can show it in a different view. So you might recognize from working in like Instagram and some of the photo apps on your phone, you might notice that sometimes they put a grid up. And when they put that grid up, it's to understand, where things should fall, where you should line things up to make them more visually interesting. And it's using a guideline a rule of thumb, if you will, called rule of thirds. And what that is it's where you divide your screen up into thirds. You divide your view up into thirds, both horizontally and vertically. So horizontally, I have placed two guides across my image, and I'm dividing into thirds going vertically as well. So horizontally and vertically. So you're making a tic-tac-toe board. Notice there are 9 equal sections that are created by 2 vertical and 2 horizontal lines. It's a tic-tac-toe board. You draw 2 up and down, 2 left and right, and you got your tic-tac-toe board. Just remember, rule of thirds, tic-tac-toe. And any question you encounter on the certification exam dealing with rule of thirds will be easy to remember that. But it's going to be 2 and 2, creating 9 equal sections. And the whole purpose of using rule of thirds, like I said, is to make things more visually interesting. Because when it's just in the center, it's not quite as interesting. So if we take this image and divide it by 3, notice the cat's eyes and face are generally lined up in this intersection area over here instead of right here in the middle. And it just creates a little bit more visual interest. The other thing is the whole body is lined up vertically here. If you were to do a shoreline, you might have, or horizon of some sort, you might have the horizon be along this line or along this line. Or if there is a picture of a boat on the horizon, you might have it intersect on the horizon line up here. The horizon line moving that way, boat over here. And maybe the sand on the beach goes kind of along here. It doesn't perfectly line up all the time, but it's in general where you want things to be placed when you are you're determining your focal point of your image, because then you can create more visual interest. All right, that's it for today. So go ahead, if you haven't already, take the quiz. Hopefully you got some good hints from this. You're going to need to know how to answer these types of questions dealing with these topics for the certification exam. All right, good luck.